guys? Okay, where's me? Welcome, everyone. Welcome and thank you, Peter Galison and Lina Hermsdorf, for making time. We're absolutely thrilled to have you. A warm welcome also to everyone who's joining us by the live stream on YouTube. My name is Friederike Sperling, and I'm head of programming at the Weisse Haus under the directorship of Alexandra Krause. I will introduce Peter Galison and Lina Hermsdorf shortly, but I wanted to say a few words on the background for this conversation today. And also I want to encourage you all to join the Q&A later on in the chat. You can bring forth questions or comments if you're logged into a YouTube or Google account. The Weisse Haus has the pleasure to present Lina Hermsdorf's solo exhibition Bona Dea in the framework of the Photo Wien Festival. In this show, Lina premieres the third episode of the eponymous audiovisual piece, in which she engages with a little-known ancient cult site in Italy, in a forest in Umbria. The historical site was back then accessible to women only, and yet until today, only male accounts have been passed on. And in search for alternative narratives, Lina interprets the forest as an autonomous corpus of knowledge and interweaves this perspective with biographical information from Paola Dionisotti, an Italian-born actress who has reached her 8th decade and also acts as the narrator in the video. And Lina, as an artist and choreographer, she examines how power structures, technology, and natural components interact with one another. She regularly incorporates the biographical data of her collaborators and the history of the site into her pieces. She has had solo exhibitions in Europe and the US, in venues including Human Resources, Künstlerin Dortmund, Jupiter Woods, Künstlerhaus Musenturm, Flat Time House, Künstlerhaus Bremen, Künstlerin Freiburg, among others. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Peter Galison, who is joining us from the US today, where he is the Pellegrino University Professor of the History of Science and of Physics at Harvard University. In 1997, Galison was awarded a John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. In 1998, the Pfizer Award for Image and Logic. In 1999, the Max Planck and Humboldt Stiftung Prize, and in 2018, the Abraham Pais Award in the History of Physics. His other books include How Experiments End, Einstein's Clocks, Poincaré's Maps, and Objectivity with Lauren Dawson. Galison collaborated with artist William Kentridge on a multi-screen installation, The Refusal of Time. And among his films are Ultimate Weapon, The H-Bomb Dilemma with Pamela Hogan. With Rob Moss, he directed and produced Secrecy, which premiered at Sundance. And Containment, about guarding radioactive materials for 10,000 years. His newest feature, Black Holes, The Edge of All We Know, now available on Netflix, explores these most mysterious objects as part of his work with the Black Hole Initiative, of which he is the director. Additionally, as a member of the Event Horizon Telescope collaboration, Peter shared in the 2020 Breakthrough Prize in Fundamental Physics for the first photograph of a black hole, and the 2021 Royal Astronomical Society Group Achievement Award. I'm very excited to be listening to you for the next 30 to 40 minutes, as I think your artistic and scientific practices feature very exciting synergies with regards to the notion of the self in relation to technology, and how technology also transforms the way we perceive nature and our surroundings, as well as the very concept of truth. Again, thank you so much for being here, and for everyone who's watching, feel free to leave any comments or questions in the chat. And now I'm handing over to you both, Peter and Lina. Thank you.
Thanks, Federica. Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction. And also thanks, Peter, for agreeing to do the talk.
Sure to be here.
Yeah, joining us. I just thought I'm just going to start a little bit with how I came across your work and why we're here today. I think I was actually reading Lorraine Dawson's Against Nature publication, in which she highlights the sort of polyphony of nature, and then came across your collaboration with her on objectivity. And I was just really fascinated on how you kind of used something very concrete, like these atlas images, to extract meaning from them and sort of to trace that changing nature of objectivity and virtues, how you call it, or these sort of competing virtues at certain times in history. And I think that was kind of like reading it, and I haven't only parts of it. Yeah, I was sort of excited to kind of see like your sensibility towards the act of speaking. How does one speak, and what kind of tools does someone use? How do subjects or how are subjects informed by certain tools, and how do the tools inform the subjects, and vice versa? And then also like the way you've dealt with very different subject matters and worked in various contexts, from like being, like having an academic kind of background, and then also moving into the arts and being a filmmaker. We have this term in German called the Universalgelehrte, which you might be familiar with. And I think, I was just, very intrigued by the way you write and the kind of, topics you have dealt with. And I think like I really wanted to use today to kind of talk about the similarities and differences in telling stories, or like telling a robust story. You used the word robust quite a lot in science and art, and how like there are synergies and similarities, and what are the differences as well. So it would be great to talk about that particular publication for a little bit, and your relationship to images as a source of extracting meaning, and then also nature, how you use the term nature in it, and how that term nature changes, and how because I think that also relates back to what I did or worked on in Bona Dea, or this particular very visual piece, which is not very typical for my work in general, if one would say so. And then throughout the talk, I will share a few moments from the piece itself. So maybe we can just, if you could give us a little bit, because obviously I've read a bit of it, but maybe our audience doesn't really know what I'm talking about when I talk about that particular piece, and how I feel it's very relevant now, or the role of images and the way we use them. If you can just give a little introduction into that work, which I think you've published in 2007, and how it came about, and how you also collaborated with Lorraine on it.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to participate in this discussion and to get to know a little bit your work, Lina, which I very much appreciate. And I look forward to thinking with you a little bit about the connections and cross currents between our work. Objectivity began really as an attempt to understand what the term itself meant in science. You might think that science and objectivity were the same thing. And what Lorraine Daston and I began to see is that there are many virtues that we might want, epistemic virtues that we might want from our science, that had nothing to do with objectivity, like precision, or quantifiability, or pedagogical utility. There are all sorts of things that you might want. Certainty, for example. Newton was interested in quantified universal laws. but he was not particularly interested in what comes to be known as objectivity. That doesn't mean he's anti-objective. It just means that that wasn't a virtue that was particularly important for that era. But in the 19th century, something happens to the way people treat the best images, the most successful images, the most important images for science. And instead of what was common in the 18th century, to treat images as idealizations of the world around us. For Goethe, Albinus, Cheselden, many others in the 18th century, of course you didn't want to describe a particular plant that might have been partially damaged by the sun or eaten by an insect. You wanted the perfect ideal, the image that lay behind all particulars that you might find. And then in the 19th century, starting around 1830 or so, people begin to look for something very different. They begin to look for ways to transfer objects onto the page, to make images as close to automatic from the world around us as they can. They want this particular plant or this particular skull or this particular tree or cloud or blood crystal. And the desire to have a kind of automatic or what we called mechanical objectivity was very much in contrast to the ideal image of the 18th century, the idea of finding a truth to a higher nature, a nature behind the nature that we happen to see. And then in the 20th century, both of these continue, but you begin to have a new idea, which is to make images that needed to be corrected in some sense with the judgment, the expert and trained judgment of scientists who were familiar with the way the machines worked. So they could avoid the artifacts, the oddities that were introduced by the machine. So in a very schematic way, we looked at the transition from ideal images to be supplemented by these mechanically produced images, to be supplemented by these trained judgment images. And in a way, we have all of those operating today, but we didn't always have them all operating. And so we began to look at as a source for these, at these volumes, these strange literary objects called scientific atlases, which were compendia of the basic working objects of each different domain, the basic clouds types, the basic plants, the basic insects, the basic crystals, and that these atlases offered an insight into the best images available at each epoch. And so what I believe is that the epistemology of science, how we gain and secure knowledge through images, was very much shaped by what counted as the best way of depicting nature at any given time.
Amazing. Yeah. Thanks, Peter, for just tracing that in such a way. There's like one quote I really liked, and I shared it with you prior to our conversation. I'm just going to read it out now because I think it's a very sort of nice way of describing like the sort of the entanglement of sort of positions that you've just described. So you say, behind the flower, the snowflake, the solar magnetogram stand not only the scientist who sees and the artist who depicts, but also a certain collective way of knowing. This knowing self is a precondition for knowledge, not an obstacle to it. Nature, knowledge, and knower intersect in these images, the visible traces of the world made intelligible. I think it's just I really sort of enjoyed reading it in such a sort of compressed, compact way. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the kind of the relationship between the term objectivity and nature, and the kind of, because also that changes very much in what you've what you've just described and what you've worked on, and kind of, yeah, you call it, like, as you said, at first, the sort of perfected nature, like removing any anomalies in images and trying to create an idealized image. And then there's the sort of truth to nature moment. And then, like, yeah, the let nature speak for itself. Could you just explain a little bit how nature is being used in relation to objectivity?
Let me begin by going back to the term objectivity itself. Objectivity always enters in contrast, like left and right or up and down. You can't, if you just had the notion of up, it wouldn't make any sense. It's always in contrast to down, as left is to right. And objectivity is always defined in contrast to subjectivity. So objectivity and subjectivity can change their meanings, and they have in dramatic ways. But it's always the case that there's some form of subjectivity against which objectivity is being presented. So the question is, what are you worried about? In Goethe's case, he was worried that you would be deceived by the strange oddities of a particular insect or a particular plant, and that the response to that, to get the best image that one could, was to find the ideal. Whereas in the 19th century, their worry was that all these different scientists each would decide on a different ideal. There would be nothing in common, and discourse would cascade into nothing but discord. And so what they wanted to do was to oppose the idea or the tendency that scientists might have individually to impose their inner desires, their hope to be able to confirm their favorite theory, for example, on what they were seeing in the world. And so their response to this cacophony of voices was to say, let's strive, let's try to abstain as much as we can from interfering with the transfer of objects in the world to the page. And if we could do that, that would be objectivity. So in a sense, the question of nature is always implicated and imbricated in these sets of relations. We never have nature without us completely. We can aspire to idealized nature in our images. We can aspire to self-abnegation, removing ourselves. We can aspire to the most carefully trained judgment, but we are always there. It's always the scientist and the collective production of knowledge. What counts as the best depiction of nature is something that is determined by more than just our desires. It's part of our collective achievement. So nature and subjectivity and objectivity are bound up with one another. That doesn't mean they're the same thing, but they pick each other out of this relationship. Objectivity is what is not subjective. And so as what counts as subjective shifts, you also have a change in objectivity. It's interesting, one of the things that comes up in the 19th century, when you develop very automatic or what they called mechanical ways of making images, like the photograph, the analog photograph, suddenly you had this worry that on the one side, scientists said, we want to make it as automatic as possible. And the artists were worried that this was, in a way, made art impossible. That is to say that the photograph could never be part of art because it was insufficiently subjective. It had an insufficient amount of the aims and desires of the maker of the image. And it's around then, it's really a 19th century notion that you really can separate science and art images in this way. I think if you asked Leonardo da Vinci, against all historical possibility, but if you were to ask Leonardo da Vinci, are your images of turbulent water scientific or artistic? I imagine that he would have said that question makes no sense, that it's an inquiry into the world around us. and it's part of art, and it's revealing the nature of water, its flow, and its turbulence. So the idea of producing a division between the subjectively inflected art and the objectively inflected science is a production that emerges alongside this idea of objectivity in the 19th century. And as you get into the later part of the 20th century, where that division holds less, I think it becomes more possible to think about a coming together in certain ways of artistic and scientific images. It's no longer a threat to scientific integrity or artistic integrity in quite the same way that it would have been in 1890 or 1920 or 1950.
Yeah, it actually, that leads quite nicely into the sort of question that I had at the very beginning, or kind of mentioned, of like that sort of historical, the change of those kind of like how subjectivity and objectivity are kind of entangled in it and like mutually dependent on each other, and that's obviously in a very I don't know. You think of like if you look at art and science these days, and I think still today there is a very much kind of distinction between the sort of scientific self and the artistic self, like, or the kind of the notion that the artistic self is still very much concerned about like subjective expression and the kind of like way of dealing with materials and topics in a sort of non whatever objective way. I'm like using these terms now not as accurate as I should do, but like, do you like, how do you see that relationship changing like these days? I feel like almost in the scientific community there is more of a shift or move towards like allowing more of a kind of experimental, accidental way of discovery, of like collaboration, which within the arts the notion of collaboration is there, but it's still very much like is the sort of individual genius artist to a certain extent that's out there. So I was wondering like whether you see like a more openness within science where within scientific research where you have more of a sort of experimental artistic approach to tackling an issue or a problem or whatever object you look at.
I do think that there is more openness now. I mean, if you think back to the 1960s or 70s, there were a few people who were very interested in producing images of scientific objects, like the flow of air around objects. This is very important for the design of aircraft and for all sorts of reasons. And there's a complicated field of fluid dynamics that handled these many problems. But from the equations alone, people were not developing the kind of intuitions and insights that they needed to advance. And so they developed these catalogs or atlases of images of, say, chalk dust being blown by air over surfaces. And you could see these beautiful curves and structures of fluid flow that were hidden in some way in the equations, but made visible. It became part of the way generations of physics students began to learn advanced fluid dynamics. But it was unusual. But over time, scientists became more and more interested in the way that images could function both as aesthetic objects and as scientifically revelatory about some domain. And now you see that in a commonplace way in the competition to get images on the cover of the great scientific journals like Science or Nature and others. And this was then bolstered even more by the development of fields where making things in science like nanocircuits and nanostructures became as important as discovering things that already existed. So part of science turned to kind of nanofabrication and other forms of making objects. And as soon as you're in the domain of making things and not just uncovering things that were already there, nobody finds a quantum dot or a quantum circuit lying around in the world. They're fabricated and not for that uninteresting. They're boundary objects between quantum theory and classical science. So I think as scientists have had to confront a world where they are making things, the idea of a horror of anything that involved the human aims and desires and intentions became much softer. It no longer seemed like a threat to science to be making and designing things. And so I think there's opened up in the last couple of decades a space that is maybe not so, that doesn't look at an image that has aesthetic content as a threat to scientific integrity. You know, you don't, scientific, in many fields no longer see an image from space science, astronomy, astrophysics, or particle physics, or other areas as unscientific because they have an aesthetic role. You know, in this experiment, this observation group that I'm part of, the Event Horizon Telescope, we made an image, we published it in 2019, and that image was then requested by the Museum of Modern Art in New York to join its permanent photographic collection, not by making a separate image that was somehow popularized or aestheticized, but that image itself. And I think there are moments, I'm not saying that every work of science is of any interest aesthetically, or every aesthetic venture is scientific, but I think that there are crossing points that don't feel so threatening to both sides. Yeah, I think that's true in your work. I mean, I see your interest in science, and I hope you'll say something about it. You know, you take images like satellite images or drone images or other kinds of images and incorporate them into the work that you're doing. You know, there's no sense in which, because it has a technological infrastructure in some sense, that it's not conceivably part of art. I mean, it's part of what you're doing is to assimilate these different kinds of knowing into the production of your of what you've done.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like the sort of composition, or I think especially with the piece Bona Dea, the video work, was, or the attempt was really to kind of look at these sort of image producing tools, and especially like a certain technology that like seems to have not the human, like sort of, it's not the human eye or the kind of perspective. It's like something that sort of like seems to be at first removed from what we can see. Mm-hmm. So I think that was definitely kind of one like that sort of pulled me towards these particular technologies, as well as kind of like mapping a side of the story that hasn't been part of history, and in that sense to kind of dragging it into it and like calling it into existence by like quite sort of directly like mapping it and like territorially like positioning it into that sort of somehow it wasn't really a made up location. I did, with the knowledge I had available, I traced the forest back to that site, but I'm not 100% sure obviously whether it was the ritual site. But I think also, like, just to come back quickly to what you mentioned earlier, what I also kind of really like the sort of notion in science of like stuff works, like the engineering aspect you've mentioned, like all of a sudden like scientists create things and work on projects that produce something else and that actually kind of work. And I think that's kind of, yeah, it's less that discovery notion or that, and more also about contributing something that then offers other possibilities and can have an actual, yeah, sort of impact. But maybe this is a good point where I can just show like a few moments of the work, and then we can talk more about, I'd really like to talk about the sort of idea of unreliable and reliable sources, and kind of uncertainty within working on, like, with that particular piece I've dealt with, where I had no access to reliable sources, and I created something that first of all should be sort of the viewer should add their own interpretation and their own story to it, but also, yeah, what do you build your practice and your work on, and yeah, what resources historically are available for you to work with. And I think I'd really like to talk to you also about your work on, or the film Black Holes, The Edge of All We Know. Yeah, but maybe this is a good point. I'll just...
Please, I would think it would be great.
It would be good too.
I'm just going to go straight through the whole script and maybe try and get those variations in. $2,035 ago, deprived of political rights, they gathered in the forest. I'll do that bit again. Okay, this is Bona Dea, take 4, and this is my own strand. 2,035 years ago. As I was growing up, I started to bleed. In the beginning, through my knickers, through my tights. It was ghastly. Schoolmates laughed at me. Every month, excruciating pain. I have reached my 8th decade. I have watched over a woman, my daughter, through the prism of being her mother. I have relived my own childhood, my teens, my early sexual awakenings. I love my work, miss it, but theatre hours were incompatible with responsible, hands-on child rearing. So in the early days of parenthood, I did mainly telly. Better paid, in the 70s and 80s, that is, and shorter hours, very few evenings. Philomena in Joe Pintaro's Snow Orchid at the Gate springs to mind, a woman terrified of the outside world, of stepping outside her home. Jude Law, a natural, I thought, and unknown at that time, playing one of my sons, the dear late Roger Lloyd Pack, my husband. Some trees, just as human tissue does when it is hurt, send out electrical signals through their leaves. I was 29. I thought I'd lived. Didn't particularly want a child, but realised I didn't not want. On the eve of the festive day, the cult image of Bona Dea was transported from her temple and set up in the festive hall, together with the image of a serpent. I meant to slow down during this bit. On the eve of the festive day, they ate, danced, and drank wine. She wanted exactly that sound, raw, simple, slowly evolving, frequencies, crackling.
Wonderful.
I just realized, yeah, it's 20 to 6 here. I think what like looking at it now, I was just thinking like what we spoke about earlier. It's like that sort of also contrasting that very personal kind of voice from Paolo with those kind of very technological images, and sort of seeing the first part of the piece, a sort of CGI material that's been that I worked with an animator who generated it in Unreal. And I really wanted him, I was like I really wanted to see, the kind of like the edges of it. I wanted to kind of have the actual, the sort of tools being visible and being seen in the work. And I think that's always something that, like in all of across my practice, is something that I carry over from, I guess, theatre, like kind of how the mechanics of how things work, and to sort of make that part of it, and this, like how we are sort of deceived and tricked and into certain illusions, into a certain seductiveness and a kind of emotional state. And yeah, kind of playing with those contrasts of the potentially ultimate objective view with the very sort of personal fragility of these different life stages of Paula, who I worked with and who was the narrator. But yeah,
no, I found it very striking, and you know, as you pull up and out to go not just from the very small to the large, but from the interior, right, to her own experience of coming of age and coming into a mindfulness of her own sexuality and of the time passage and subsequent generations. And then as you're pulling up through the forest, you know, up into the canopy and then into this realm that is a kind of scientific view. I mean, a kind of up above view, a view that is far beyond anything that refers to the interiority of a subjective experience. And I thought that it works really well, and I found it very striking, quite moving.
Thanks. No, that's good to hear. That works. I think also one thing I wanted to talk to you about, maybe before we kind of go into the Q&A, is like, how does it, for you as being a filmmaker, how do you sort of, I guess you can talk a bit about the film about black holes, the most recent one. How does that, I mean, just the title of The Edge of All We Know, just the title of the piece itself is kind of like, how do you say, poignant, like, and it is still, I've heard you saying in other interviews, you like that sort of didactic notion of like documentary and kind of explaining something, but it's kind of like, is both sort of works on this, it has the animation parts of it, and it's kind of explaining by not but not really leaving it in this other sphere. And I think that's kind of quite beautiful to kind of tackle that, and also the journey of like scientist who's starting to bring it together. And I really enjoyed the moments where people are just in like walking in the forest and kind of discussing things, and kind of where you come to some sorry, I'm just rambling, but could you like elaborate on that a bit?
Yes, you know, in one sense, the film it has emotion, the move from trying to find this image to making an image of a black hole to capturing it, worrying about whether it's right and does it accurately depict what's out there, and then sharing it with the world, and then a parallel story on the theoretical side. But it's also, I wanted to capture something about, there's certain objects in science or certain pursuits in science which, not just in its popular register, but for the people who are working in these areas, have a more extended meaning. And black holes are one of them. I mean, everybody's interested in black holes. And for similar reasons, the scientists, as well as, you know, everyday metaphors that we use, that, you know, something is the state is a black hole, or we refer to somebody as being like a black hole. I mean, it's become a metaphor that captures our imagination in insofar as it's a region of the universe where you can go one way, but you can't come out. And I think this idea of a membrane of one-way passage is so redolent, so suggestive of our thoughts about death. I mean, we all can and will pass from living to dead, but people don't come back. I think that makes these objects, these strange, most mysterious things, all carry more than simply that which is captured by equations or models or simulations or observations. And so I wanted to capture that multiplicity of levels of meaning that the black hole has, that it's, I mean, even in the most hard-boiled scientific circles, people will say, I wonder what it would be like at the end of my life to fall into a black hole and experience what happens past the horizon. I mean, there is this evocativeness to it that I wanted to capture through certain visual aspects of kinds of animation and simulations and physical models of swirling water with dye in them, as well as the very practical side of things, and to sort of see science in the making rather than science as a completed object, which was just being explained or popularized. So that was my hope for the film, that it would be itself a kind of evocative object.
Yeah, I like the sort of idea of, yes, sort of showing the science in the making as the processual nature of it. But also what you just, what I also really found very striking is the obviously that everyone wasn't allowed to share what they were working on in order to create that image, which kind of, and yeah, I guess to kind of like sum it up a little bit, like the sort of idea of seeing is believing, or like only things come into existence when we see them with our own eyes, and sort of working towards something that metaphorically black holes, they exist, but like to kind of formulate an image to prove, like, I mean, there's this famous, like, everything we imagine exists. So kind of like what is that sort of visual depiction that you need to, as evidence. And I think also like this idea within science, sort of simulation versus simulating something versus the actual thing as such. And I think that's what within art, what I always find like that sort of playground area that you work in, and you play, you test things, you play around with materials, with text, you compose things to kind of come to something that is something you can probably in the real world with consequences not do. And yeah, this sort of aspect of simulation within science as well as within art, I think, is an interesting tool. But maybe we kind of need to open this up now to there's so many other things I really wanted to talk to you about, but I think we kind of sort of moved through a few things that
feel free to, I don't know, discuss one or two other questions. I think we still have.
I respond maybe to something that that Lina just said. There's ways in which simulations is making a kind of a living copy of something out in the world is so important in so many branches of science now, that it's a kind of mediation between theory and observation, or theory and experiment, that simulations is the way of bringing a controllable world inside a computer, for example, or mechanically into the flow of water, for instance. That's also a form of simulation modeling. Another thought that I had is that, Lina, in your work, as in the beginning of the piece that you showed us, there's a kind of framing when the speaker says, here's take 4, and then begins to speak. So right from the beginning of the piece, there's a kind of enframing that takes place, that there's not just the dialogical, the kind of motion through the presence in the work, but it's also the framing of the work, the making of the work is actually part of the work. And I think that scientists often, and certainly documentary film about science is often makes, I think, the mistake of thinking that it's a demerit, it's something bad to show process with all of its faults and mistakes and uncertainties and anxieties, and instead want it to be either a straightforward race to find something or a finished product that then just needs to be popularized or simplified. And finally, I think that there's something that I think we both share as an interest in story and storytelling, which is, inside scientists, scientific arguments, even something as seemingly dry as a proof in mathematics, has a narrative structure. It's a story that's being told. And a good metaphorical structure in science is actually what makes scientific theory work, to be able to sustain, to say, this behaves like a pendulum, and you can see, and then you can see this and this and this and this and this that's like a pendulum. If it's just a one-off metaphor, a black hole's like a drain, but it's kind of like a dark patch. I mean, if you just keep changing your metaphors, you actually haven't understood anything. So the process of sustaining a metaphor, of making a story, an argument that moves across from beginning assumptions to conclusion, is actually part of what makes a good scientific argument. And I think that, in some forms, certainly in many forms of time-based media, but not just, or theater, which you come from, there is a story is what holds it together, even if the story doesn't have a traditional form of, a setup conflict, a reversal and a resolution. Stories have many, many varieties, but I think understanding what drives forward our accounts is part of what we want, both from art and from science.
Yeah, I can just agree to that.
Yes, thank you both so much for this conversation, for this very stimulating and inspirational conversation. I want to encourage, again, the audience to leave any comments or questions in the chat, as we don't have any questions yet. So maybe I will just make a little start. What I find striking and very special about Lina's work, Bona Dea, is how you actually try to bring in and sort of broaden perspectives, and to also open the field for more speculative accounts, for more speculative sort of narratives. And in so doing, you actually also consider a sort of geopoetic perspective, one that also, considers nature as a subject. And obviously, one might provocatively say that this is very much an opposite to the sort of traditional science, or the work of a scientist who is trying to find the best depiction of, or an image of, a black hole, or any other kind of picture. And so I was wondering if we could maybe elaborate a little bit on of science, and also its relation to neutrality versus objectivity, science from the global north, and to what extent it might also actually learn from other sort of cosmologies on nature, and sort of cultures that actually conceive of nature as a subject. If you could maybe elaborate on this a little bit.
Lina, do you want to start?
I wonder how yeah, I mean, I guess like how, I'm not quite sure how to answer, like how to give an actual answer to this, but I think what the sort of treating or the way like I have the forest as a subject in the piece, for instance, is a kind of is first of all like sort of try to recreate the actual nature in this other technology, as well as having like sort of there are in the text references to like how like the mycelium, like the network communicates, which is like always kind of these different layers, how it's like a very fragmented text, like that kind of like evolves over time and comes together, and it's like kind of, I feel like it sort of communicates with the sort of story of Paulo in its very own way. And it's embed, like it's the form is language, which is a weird one. It's a very strange one to work with language within art, and I still struggle with it, because you like really run into like, oh, you need like, you kind of can't have it as you need to have it in the object, you need to have it in the sound, you need to, but I'm kind of quite interested in those, like, and that comes from theater. What is the text in a space, and what does the text do with all the other objects surrounding it? But I think, yeah, I'm not quite sure if I can answer it really. Like, I think you sort of answered it in your question, but maybe Peter, you have a better.
One thing that struck me, many things about your piece, is that it's not just personal. It's not just, you know, I remember thinking. It's the Paula says, you know, is talking about herself in an embodied way. I mean, she's a person with thoughts and memories and reflections, but also an embodied person, a person who's coming to terms with her own existence as a woman and what that meant. And I thought that you know, we're right away in saying this is take 4. We're both in the framing of the, you know, almost a theatrical or filmic register outside of the diegesis, but then we're also in nature, in her, you know, that and in her own experience of being an embodied being. And I thought that then when you come out and up, there's almost I mean, literally and figuratively, a vertiginous feeling. You know, we're suddenly out of that personal domain, looking down upon it. And that change of perspective, that shift from embodied subjective to observation to, you know, this high level vision of the world as sort of graspable in its totality, or that part of the world in any case, I found very, very striking. And you know, nature changes its meaning as you go from the lived, involved nature or the filmed nature to the observational nature from above. And it's that kind of shift that I think is so interesting, that nature is never just nature. It's always nature with us. I mean, there's nothing we can say. I mean, it's sort of a Kantian thought. There's nothing we can say that is entirely devoid of us. You know, we're always reporting. We're always the ones who experience reporting, remembering, speculating, proving.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very, that kind of fabrication, which I think is also in showing how the work is produced, or that sort of notion of fabricating any sort of, like topic or like things that we deal with. And also I think maybe what I also would like to mention in this context is, or what's very important to me is also those perspective of her as being much older than me, and having these multiple voices and these multiple perspectives also as sort of as part of the work, which in like, I've worked with my younger sister like a couple of years ago on another piece, and she was 12 then, and then we did another iteration of the piece when she was 18, and kind of those sort of life cycles, or that those experiences, they sort of inform each like each work that whoever I work with, they become part of the piece. And I think, I see it a little bit almost as how we are informed by other like institutions or like schools or whatever we go through. That will always be part of anything we deal with. Like and this kind of idea of the neutral or is not. Is luckily not achievable and should never be.
I actually have one more question, because in one of your articles, Peter, you actually write that black holes evoke loss. And now, since 2019, that we are able to actually depict this loss. I was wondering if you think, or if you might say that this helps sensitize mankind for the fragility of ecosystems, the ecological crisis, or rather that it sort of underscores this illusion of the superiority of humans over nature. And also I remember that in this article you also talked about this image from the Apollo 11 mission that totally shifted our idea of centrality and dominance. And if you would actually anticipate that this this depiction or this image of the black hole, the first image, might have a similar effect in the long run?
I do think certain images can recalibrate our relationship to the world. And I think art aspires to that in many ways and succeeds in doing it in theater performance, in painting and in film. I think in science, there's certain images that have had this feature. You know, if you think back on Hooke's Micrographia, these images of the flea, of there being a micro world that had up until then eluded us, and that changed our relationship with the outside, or the pictures of the Earth from the outside. It's not that people couldn't imagine it. People had been imagining looking at the Earth from far away for hundreds of years, but seeing a picture that had been taken of Earthrise or the other images, and I think the black hole image is a bit like that. There's something that has a kind of, you know, classically defined sublime to it, you know, that it reestablishes in a kind of terror, that is to say, a registration of our small scale against this object, which is bigger than the solar system and into which anything can fall and nothing can emerge. I think that even, you know, my experience in the collaboration, there were about 200 of us, was that people felt very strongly that they had simulated it, they had modeled it, they knew the equations for it, they'd been looking for it for decades. But when we actually saw it, it had a different kind of effect. And seeing an image can have that recalibration.
Cool. So there's still no question or comment in the chat. And it's also already 3 minutes past 7.
Well, thank you very much for including me. It's a pleasure to get to know you, Federica, and to meet you, Lina, and to see the remarkable work that you're doing. And I hope the conversation can continue.
Yes. Oh, actually, we do have one question. Are you still open for this, or?
Okay.
It just appeared. A note from Alice Harry. Hi, Peter and Lina. Great talk. Wonderful. If you could talk about the ethics behind telling an untold in history or unseen in science story.
Lina?
Okay. The ethics. It is kind of, it's very delicate because you I was actually also thinking about, I don't know, Peter, if you're familiar with Walter Benjamin's sort of concept on history, and that kind of idea, like anything that truth never escapes us, or anything we kind of look at, or we can move into history, we can sort of from the here turn it into something that can become part of certain histories, and we can rewrite it, and we should rewrite it because it's like a kind of is a history of winners. And I think we can all participate in that sense, as if I understand the question right, as ethics, we all need to work and contribute as much as we can to kind of look at these stories and bring them into the visibility. But also then there are views, there is a social community that, or an audience that will discuss, judge, review, and also push it out if it's not something that should be part of it. And I think that kind of discursive nature is very important. And
I would say, you know, one of the things that struck me that I hadn't anticipated at all in the black hole work was that one of the observatories is on Bona Dea in Hawaii, which has been much contested. And I mean, the mountain there has been a site of some conflict between people that wanted to build a huge telescope and Native Hawaiians. But one of the things, the telescope we use is much smaller, not part of that giant apparatus. But the one of the things that struck me was that one of the people who has been most active in rebuilding and getting taught the Native Hawaiian language is Larry Kimura, and he had named the black hole that we saw of M87, this donut-shaped object in the sky, after a line from the most famous and important creation story that exists in the Hawaiian tradition. And it was called Powehi, which roughly translated, as I understand it, to the sort of the light of unending creation. And I think that what I would say in response to the very interesting question is that the sky is something that's multiply interpreted all the time from different cultures. And I think there is an ethical importance in seeing and learning from other cultures about how they understand the sky, which is both shared and different in the way we see it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this beautifully sums up this conversation. Again, thank you both very much for making time, for joining us from London and from the US. Have a very good day and evening.
Thank you both.
Yes, let's continue the talk, the dialogue.
Very good. I look forward to that.
Thank you.